For centuries, Russia believed winter was its greatest weapon. The cold destroyed Napoleon. The ice stopped Hitler. But this winter, something terrifying happened. Winter turned against Russia itself. While missiles rained down on Ukraine, millions of Russians are freezing inside their own homes. No electricity, no heating. Children shivering in classrooms. Old people screaming under snow. This is not war. This is not a natural disaster. This is what happens when a state chooses missiles over people. Tonight, you're going to see how the world's biggest energy superpower is unable to keep its own citizens warm, and why this winter may mark the beginning of the end. For centuries, Russia has relied on a force more loyal than generals and more reliable than diplomacy. Winter. Long before modern borders and missile systems, the Russian state learned that cold itself could be weaponized. Napoleon learned it the hard way when his army disintegrated in the snow. Hitler learned it again when steel tanks froze into useless monuments outside Moscow. Winter became part of Russia's national mythology, a silent guardian that appeared whenever leadership failed or strategy collapsed. It was not just weather, it was destiny. But in December 2025, that mythology shattered. For the first time in modern Russian history, winter did not protect the Kremlin. It exposed it. It stripped away propaganda, speeches and slogans and revealed a system rotting from within. While Russian missiles exploded over Ukrainian cities, another war was unfolding inside Russia itself. A war without enemies, without soldiers and without headlines. This war was fought in frozen apartments, dark hospitals and silent boiler rooms. There were no NATO weapons here, no foreign saboteurs, no Western conspiracies. There were only neglected pipes, collapsing infrastructure, and citizens abandoned by their own states. This was not a natural disaster. This was the physical consequence of political neglect. To understand how deep this failure runs, one must leave behind Moscow's illuminated streets and travel east into Siberia, to places that appear in Kremlin speeches only when mobilization quotas must be filled. One such place is the Irkutsk region, and within it, the city of Angarsk. Officially, Angarsk is described as an industrial pillar of Siberia, a legacy city of Soviet engineering built to power factories, refineries, and the empire itself. In reality, by December 2025, Angarsk resembled less a functioning city and more a survival camp struggling against nature. On December 7th, a critical failure occurred at thermal power plant number 9, the main source of heating and electricity for the city. The second steam boiler collapsed, not because of sabotage or war damage, but because it could no longer endure decades of wear, corrosion and temporary fixes. This boiler had exceeded its designed lifespan long ago, kept alive through patchwork repairs instead of replacement. When it failed, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Within minutes, approximately 167,000 residents lost access to heating and electricity. Entire neighborhoods were plunged into darkness, radiators went cold, water pipes froze solid. Outside temperatures hovered around minus 22 degrees Celsius during the day and plunged to minus 32 degrees at night. Inside apartments, frost formed on walls and ceiling, windows iced over from the inside, furniture cracked. The mayor declared a state of emergency, but a declaration on paper does not generate. Hospitals were forced to suspend procedures. Doctors examined patients in winter jackets, nurses portable lamps as power flickered. Kindergartens wrapped children in blankets and coats, trying to keep them warm while waiting for instructions from another care. Some schools remained open, turning classrooms into freezing boxes where children sat in hats and gloves, their breath visible in the air as they tried to write with numb fingers. Social media filled with anger and disbelief. Residents openly questioned the state's priorities. One post read, "Putin says Russia is the world's 4th largest economy. Then why are we freezing like it's the 19th century?" Another wrote, "Officials tell us not to use electric heaters because the grid will collapse. Fine. Then explain how we are supposed to keep babies alive at minus 32. These were not exaggerations or emotional outbursts. They were survival questions. Parents worried about infants. Elderly people feared sleeping through the night. Families boiled water on gas stoves just to produce a little warmth. And Angarsk was not alone. Across Siberia and Russia's far eastern regions, similar incidents unfolded quietly. Heating systems failed. Power grids overloaded. Emergency repairs were promised but delayed. The national media largely ignored these stories, focusing instead on battlefield updates and official speeches. Frozen apartments do not fit heroic narratives, yet freezing kills as efficiently as bombs. The humiliation for the Kremlin lies in a simple fact. Russia is one of the largest energy producers on Earth. It exports oil, gas and electricity across continents. It threatens foreign governments by turning pipelines on and off, yet it cannot reliably heat its own citizens. This contradiction is not accidental, it is structural. The backbone of Russia's heating infrastructure was built during the Soviet era, primarily in the 1960s and 1970s. These systems were designed to last 25 to 30 years. That lifespan expired decades ago. Instead of modernizing, Russian authorities chose cheaper solutions. Pipes were patched instead of replaced. Boilers were repaired instead of rebuilt. Maintenance budgets were cut, while money flowed into prestige projects, luxury developments, and eventually war. For more than 20 years, infrastructure was treated as an afterthought. The assumption was that people would endure just as they always have. Endurance became a substitute for investment. By December 2025, this assumption collapsed into the weight of reality. Residents of Angarsk openly stated that no serious infrastructure work had been done in 30 years. Temporary shelters were set up for a few thousand people, but more than 170,000 remained in freezing homes. The math did not work because the system was never designed to protect everyone, only to appear functional. Winter had arrived, and this time it was not an ally. It was a mirror reflecting the true condition of the state. A frozen city inside sent a message more powerful than any protest or opposition speech. The state could no longer perform its most basic function, but people warned, and this was only the beginning. And this was only the beginning, because the freezing of Angarsk was not an isolated malfunction, but the first visible crack in a system already hollowed out by years of war-driven priorities, demographic extraction and administrative decay. And to understand why the state could not respond effectively, one must look not at the cold itself, but at what the cold revealed about who had been taken from these regions and for what purpose. Siberia, the Far East and Russia's ethnic republics have long existed in a different political reality than Moscow and St. Petersburg, functioning less as equal parts of a federation and more as reservoirs of labour, resources and bodies. When the war in Ukraine escalated, these regions were not consulted, persuaded or inspired, they were harvested. Mobilization orders fell hardest on places like Irkutsk, Buryatia, Tuva, Yakutia and the rural districts surrounding them, areas already weakened by poverty, limited opportunity and chronic underinvestment. In these places, the promise of a stable civilian future had been eroded long before the war began, leaving military service as one of the few remaining paths to income, however dangerous or coercive that path might be. Official statistics confirmed that thousands of men from Siberia were sent to the front in the early waves of mobilization, but independent investigations and regional reporting suggest that the true number was far higher, obscured by incomplete records, pressure on families to remain silent, and a media environment hostile to transparency. What matters even more than the raw numbers is the role these men played before they were sent away, because they were not only sons and fathers, but also mechanics, electricians, boiler technicians, drivers, snowplow operators, pipe fitters, engineers and municipal workers. The very people required to keep a cold region society functioning when temperatures dropped below survivable levels. When mobilization emptied towns of working-age men, it did not only weaken families, it dismantled the invisible systems that hold winter cities together. Heating networks require constant maintenance, boilers require skilled operators, power grids need technicians who understand aging equipment. Snow must be cleared not by decree, but by drivers who know the roads and machines. By sending these men to the front lines, the state did not simply sacrifice lives, it removed the human infrastructure that winter survival depends on. This reality became impossible to ignore as failures multiplied. In Angarsk and neighbouring towns, emergency repair crews were understaffed, exhausted or non-existent. Calls went unanswered, not because officials did not care, but because there was no one left to send. Replacement workers could not be trained quickly enough, and even if they could, the equipment they were meant to repair was decades old, incompatible with modern parts, and increasingly impossible service under sanctions that restricted access to foreign technology. The result was paralysis. Local authorities issued instructions that revealed the depth of the crisis without meaning to. Residents were told not to use electricity, not to overload the grid, not to complain, not to panic, not to expect immediate solutions. These warnings exposed that the system was operating at the edge of collapse even before winter reached its peak. Schools were kept open not because conditions were safe, but because parents were needed at work. Feeding an economy now structured around wartime production and logistics. Children sat in classrooms wearing winter clothing, their education reduced to endurance training, learning not chemistry or literature, but how to remain still long enough to preserve body heat. In hospitals, staff improvised, clustering patients into fewer heated rooms, postponing care that would be routine in any functioning state, and silently hoping that no major emergencies would occur during blackout periods. Elderly residents, many of whom survived previous Soviet era hardships, found themselves once again boiling water, sealing windows with makeshift insulation, and sleeping fully dressed to conserve warmth. These scenes were not broadcast nationally. They were shared quietly through local channels and private messages, because acknowledging them publicly would contradict the image of strength projected by the central government. Meanwhile, the same dynamic dynamic played out beyond Angarsk. Along the Baikal Highway and other trans-Siberian routes, snowstorms combined with insufficient maintenance to create deadly bottlenecks. Traffic jams stretched for tens of kilometers, trapping families inside vehicles for days at temperatures approaching minus 30 degrees Celsius. Fuel ran low, food supplies dwindled. Panic spread as people realized that help might not arrive in time. When official explanations came, they followed a familiar pattern. Blame was assigned to drivers, weather or individual mistakes, never to systemic neglect. Yet the underlying cause was always the same: a shortage of personnel and preparation in regions stripped of manpower by mobilization and drained of investment by decades of centralized decision-making. Even wealthier regions began to show cracks. In cities like Kazan and Ufa, municipal leaders admitted publicly that they lacked sufficient snow removal crews, that vacancies remained unfilled, and that the first heavy snowfall turned modern urban centres into paralyzed zones. These admissions were rare moments of honesty, revealing that the problem was not limited to distant Siberian towns but was spreading across the Federation. The question of where the workers had gone required no investigation. They were in Ukraine, digging trenches, guarding positions, or already dead. Others had fled abroad, unwilling to be mobilized or unable to reconcile survival with loyalty to a state that demanded sacrifice without protection. This exodus created a feedback loop. As infrastructure failed, living conditions worsened, prompting more people to leave if they could, further weakening the system left behind. In the coldest regions such as Yakutsk, where winter dominates most of the year and preparation is a matter of survival, even minor disruptions became life-threatening. Delayed buses stranded residents outdoors. Icy roads turned commutes into hazards. Emergency services struggled to respond on time, not because of incompetence, but because of sheer absence. Every failure traced back to the same source: a state that prioritized war over maintenance, spectacle over systems, and territorial ambition over human resilience. By the time temperatures dropped further, the consequences were no longer abstract. They were measured in frostbite cases, respiratory illnesses, and quiet deaths that never made national statistics. The Kremlin continued to speak of strategic initiative, of strength, of endurance, but endurance is not infinite, and winter does not negotiate. As the cold deepened, it became clear that Russia was not merely experiencing a harsh season, but entering a phase where the physical environment was exposing the full cost of choices made far from frozen apartments and darkened streets. The war had not only moved resources outward, it had hollowed the interior, leaving regions defenseless against the very element that once defined Russian power. And as winter tightened its grip, the realization spread quietly among those shivering in the dark that this was not misfortune, but consequence. As winter tightened its grip and the consequences became unavoidable, the crisis moved beyond individual cities and began to reveal itself as a nationwide structural breakdown, one that could no longer be explained away as local incompetence or unfortunate coincidence, because the same pattern was repeating across thousands of kilometers, from the forests of Siberia to the Volga region and the Russian Far East, exposing a state that had lost the capacity to govern normal life while remaining obsessively focused on war. Roads that were supposed to serve as lifelines turned into traps. The trans-Siberian highway system, the backbone of east-west movement, became increasingly unreliable as snow removal crews failed to keep pace with storms that were neither unusual nor unexpected. In several regions, traffic jams stretched for dozens and sometimes hundreds of kilometers, trapping families, truck drivers, and elderly passengers inside vehicles for days at temperatures that made survival uncertain. Parents rationed fuel to keep engines running just long enough to produce heat, calculating minutes like currency, while children cried in the back seats wrapped in layers of clothing that could not fully protect them from the cold seeping through metal doors. Emergency services arrived late or not at all, not because they were unaware of the situation, but because they lacked personnel, equipment, and coordination. When explanations finally came, they followed a familiar script. Officials blamed individual drivers, poor visibility, or violations of traffic rules, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement that the system itself had failed. This pattern of denial extended into cities that had long been showcased as symbols of stability and prosperity. In Kazan, the capital of Tatarstan, and a city proud of hosting international summits and sporting events, the first heavy snowfall exposed a shocking lack of preparedness. Streets became impassable, public transport stalled, and pedestrians slipped on untreated sidewalks. Even the mayor publicly admitted that the city could organise global conferences but could not cope with winter weather that arrived every year without exception. In neighbouring Ufa, the situation was even more revealing. Municipal authorities quietly confirmed that hundreds of snow removal and maintenance positions remained vacant, positions that had once been filled by experienced workers who knew the city's infrastructure intimately. Those workers were gone, drafted, dead or displaced, and no amount of administrative orders could conjure replacements overnight. This shortage extended far beyond snow removal. Plumbing crews were understaffed. Heating technicians were overworked. Electrical engineers were stretched thin, responding to emergencies across vast territories with aging equipment and limited resources. In colder regions where winter lasts the majority of the year, such as Yakutia, even small delays became potentially fatal. Residents describe waiting for buses that never arrived, standing outdoors in temperatures where exposed skin freezes in minutes, while authorities insisted that services were operating within normal parameters. Normality, however, had ceased to exist. Each failure fed into another, creating a cascading collapse that affected not just comfort but survival. Hospitals faced rolling blackouts, clinics postponed care, pharmacies struggled to maintain refrigeration for essential medicine. In many places, the burden of adaptation fell entirely on citizens. People sealed windows with plastic and tape, moved entire families into single rooms to conserve heat, and shared generators where they could afford them. But adaptation has limits, especially in a country where wages in many regions barely cover food and utilities even in good times. The irony of the situation was impossible to ignore. Russia, a nation that defines itself as an energy superpower, was unable to deliver basic heating to millions of its own citizens. Gas flowed westward and southward across borders. Oil left ports. Export revenues continued to be discussed in official briefings, yet inside Russia, radiators remained cold. This contradiction was not merely embarrassing, dangerous. It eroded the implicit social contract that had sustained the political system for years. The unspoken agreement that citizens would tolerate limited political freedom in exchange for stability and basic security. As winter stripped that stability away, questions began to surface, not in organised protests, but in conversations, messages and quiet resentment. Why was there always money for missiles but not for boilers? Why were power plants patched instead of replaced? Why did regions that contributed manpower, resources and loyalty receive neglect in return? The answers pointed back to a centralised model that prioritised spectacle and confrontation over maintenance and care. Defence and security consumed an ever-growing share of the federal budget, while regional infrastructure budgets stagnated or shrank. Decisions were made far from the realities of frozen pipes and snowed-in highways by officials the consequences of failure. As sanctions tightened and access to Western technology diminished, the fragility of the system increased further. Spare parts for aging equipment became harder to obtain. Replacement components were delayed, improvised, or unavailable altogether. Even when parts could be sourced domestically, the expertise required to install and maintain them was often missing. Engineers had left the country unwilling to risk mobilization or repression. Others had been absorbed into the military-industrial complex or directly into the army. Training new specialists takes years, not months, and winter does not wait. The result was a vicious cycle. Infrastructure failures worsened living conditions, which encouraged further emigration or avoidance of public service jobs, which in turn deepened the shortages. Meanwhile, the official narrative remained disconnected from reality. State television spoke of resilience, unity, and national strength, while citizens watched their breath freeze inside their own homes. The contrast between rhetoric and experience grew impossible to ignore. In some regions, local officials attempted to bridge the gap with honesty, admitting shortages and asking for patience, but their appeals rang hollow without resources or authority to enact real change. The deeper truth was the state had become reactive rather than proactive, lurching from crisis to crisis, issuing temporary fixes instead of addressing root causes. Winter magnified every weakness, turning small inefficiencies into life-threatening emergencies. What had once been hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and propaganda was now laid bare by ice and darkness. The environment itself had become an auditor, exposing decades of misallocation, neglect and extraction. As temperatures continued to drop and forecasts promised weeks more of extreme cold, a quiet realization spread among those affected. This was not a temporary hardship that would pass with the season. It was a preview of a future shaped by continued prioritization of war over welfare, of expansion over preservation. Freezing cities, blocked highways and darkened hospitals were not anomalies. They were signals that a system built on endurance rather than renewal was reaching its limits, and that the cost of ignoring those limits would be paid not by those who made the decisions but by those who shivered beneath them.
As the winter crisis deepened and the state's inability to respond became undeniable, attention slowly shifted from frozen apartments and paralyzed roads to the larger machinery driving this collapse, revealing that what Russia was experiencing was not merely a seasonal emergency, but the logical outcome of a war economy consuming its own foundations. The same government struggled to deliver heat to its citizens, continued to allocate enormous resources to military operations, weapons production, and internal security, treating civilian infrastructure as expendable collateral in a broader geopolitical gamble. Budget documents showed defense and security spending reaching unprecedented levels, while regional maintenance funds remained stagnant or were quietly redirected. Every missile launched, every armored vehicle produced, every new battalion formed represented not just money spent, but opportunity lost. Boilers not replaced, pipes not modernized, and power grids left to decay further. In places like Angarsk, residents understood this instinctively, calculating that the cost of a single advanced missile could have funded a complete overhaul of their failing thermal plant, preventing the suffering of tens of thousands. This realization fueled a growing sense of betrayal, especially among communities that had already paid disproportionately in blood. Families who had lost sons and fathers to the war now found themselves freezing in silence, receiving neither protection nor acknowledgement from the state they had sacrificed for. The psychological impact of this double loss was profound, eroding trust not through dramatic rebellion, but through quiet withdrawal. People stopped believing official promise, stopped expecting timely help, and began relying solely on themselves and their immediate communities. In some regions, informal networks emerged to share generators, fuel, and food, echoing survival strategies more commonly associated with failed states than with the nuclear-armed superpower. At the same time, the economic on the consequences of the war compounded the crisis. Sanctions restricted access to advanced technology and components essential for maintaining aging infrastructure. Import substitution programs promised domestic alternatives, but these often proved inadequate, delayed, or incompatible with existing systems. Even when equipment could be sourced, skilled labor was scarce. Engineers, technicians, and specialists had either been mobilized, absorbed into the defense sector, or had left the country altogether, unwilling to live under constant threat of conscription or repression. Training replacements required time and stability, neither of which were available. As a result, repairs became increasingly improvised. Temporary fixes layered upon older temporary fixes, pushing systems closer to catastrophic failure. Meanwhile, the state's messaging grew more detached from lived reality. Official statements emphasized resilience, rode with historical endurance and national destiny, invoking the memory of past hardships as justification for present suffering. But the comparison rang hollow. Previous generations endured war and deprivation with the promise of rebuilding and progress. In contrast, the current crisis offered no clear horizon beyond continued sacrifice. The social contract that had sustained political stability for years, trading political passivity for material security, was quietly unraveling. People did not need opposition leaders or foreign media to tell them something was wrong. The cold itself delivered that message each night. As the winter wore on, reports emerged of unpaid wages in key industries, including energy and extraction sectors traditionally considered pillars of the economy. Oil workers complained of delayed salaries. Refinery maintenance was postponed. In some cases, production slowed not because of lack of demand, but because of damaged facilities and insufficient staff. These developments carried profound implications. Energy exports had long financed both the state budget and the war effort. As infrastructure degraded and revenues declined, the financial base supporting military operations weakened. This vulnerability did not go unnoticed beyond Russia's borders. Ukraine, having endured repeated attacks on its own energy system, adapted by decentralizing power generation and hardening critical infrastructure. Businesses installed generators. Communities organized local solutions. The attempt to freeze Ukraine into submission backfired, producing resilience rather than collapse. At the same time, Ukrainian forces began targeting the economic arteries fueling the war, striking oil refineries, storage facilities, and logistics hubs deep inside Russian territory. Each successful strike reduced refining capacity, disrupted exports, and tightened financial constraints. The effect was cumulative. Damaged facilities took months to repair, if repairs were possible at all. Insurance costs soared. Shipping routes grew riskier. Buyers demanded discounts. Revenues fell. The boomerang effect became impossible to ignore. Efforts to destroy Ukraine's energy system accelerated the degradation of Russia's own. As export income declined, the state faced harder choices. Continue funding war at the expense of domestic stability, or divert resources inward and risk strategic setbacks abroad. So far, the choice remained consistent. Prioritizing military objectives while managing civilian hardship through rhetoric and repression. Yet repression cannot generate heat, and rhetoric cannot repair pipe. The physical reality of winter imposed limits that ideology could not overcome. In interviews conducted by independent and exiled media, residents of affected regions spoke with a mixture of anger, exhaustion, and resignation. A mother from Angarsk described surviving days without heating at temperatures approaching minus 50 degrees in previous winter, asking what parents were supposed to do with small children when the state's only instruction was to conserve electricity. Such testimonies revealed not only suffering, but a profound sense of abandonment. Appeals to central authorities went unanswered, or received generic replies disconnected from local conditions. The image of a strong, omnipotent state fractured into a mosaic of neglect and indifference. As winter approached its harshest phase, the cumulative effect of these failures became visible in subtle but significant ways. Police stations reported fewer applicants. Municipal jobs remained unfilled. Young people planned departures rather than futures. The demographic and institutional hollowing accelerated, feeding the same cycle that caused the crisis in the first place. Observers began to describe the situation not as resistance or revolt, but as system exhaustion. A structure designed to extract loyalty, resources, and manpower without reinvestment was reaching the limits of what it could extract. The environment, indifferent to ideology, was enforcing accountability where political mechanisms could not. In this context, the image Vladimir Putin sought to cultivate, that of a leader restoring imperial greatness and historical continuity, clashed violently with the reality unfolding across frozen regions. Instead of consolidation, the state presided over fragmentation. Instead of renewal, liquidation. The silence in understaffed municipal offices, the darkness in unheated apartments, and the fires burning in damaged refineries all pointed to the same conclusion. The center could no longer hold everything together. This did not mean immediate collapse or dramatic overthrow. Systems rarely fail that way. They erode, normalize dysfunction, and adapt downward, redefining survival as success. But erosion has consequences, especially in a country where climate leaves little margin for error. Winter would return again next year, and the year after that, each time testing whether lessons had been learned or ignored. If priorities remained unchanged, each winter would arrive not as a challenge to overcome, but as a verdict reaffirmed. In the end, the most powerful indictment of the system was not delivered by foreign government sanctions or critic, but by the cold itself. Silent, relentless, and impartial, it measured the distance between ambition and capability, between propaganda and provision. And as millions of Russians endured another freezing night, it became increasingly clear that this was not a temporary crisis, but a defining chapter in the story of a state that chose war over warmth, power over people, and in doing so, allowed its greatest historical ally to become its most unforgiving judge.